Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to be having a look at a classic. This is the 1976 mould by ESCI of the Panzer 35T, or the Skoda 35T, depending on which nation happens to be operating the vehicle.
Just a little side note, the Panzer 35T was actually a Czechoslovakian tank called the Skoda LT V735, which was developed before World War II, but when the Nazis invaded or annexed Czechoslovakia, they captured a lot of their tanks. This also included the Panzer 38T, which I've done a video on, along with some of its later war variants. However, today we'll just focus on the 35T. In German service, the tank was just given the abbreviation Panzerkampfwagen. It kept the 35, and the T stands for the German word for Czech, which I definitely cannot pronounce.
This kit has actually been relatively recently re-released. Italeri tend to retread some of the old ESCI molds, and in 2021 they did just that with this kit, so it is still available. And if you want to build one of these kits, you can come on down to Tectonic Hobbies, and if we don't have one in stock, we're happy to order one in for you. But yeah, so we'll be building this kit, and when you have a little look in the video, you'll be able to tell it's quite old, because you'll see a lot of the plastic has actually started to warp and bend a little bit, and well, you can't see it, but the box smells like really weird.
Upon opening the box, you are greeted with a set of instructions and some decals, both of which, unlike many modern kits these days, are not censored. And you also get two sets of sprues with some tan kind of coloured plastic, and also a set of rubber band tracks. I gave all of these sprues a nice wash in some warm soapy water. However, I noticed that some of the sprues had kind of warped, and a few of the parts were a little bit bent, as you might see as the video progresses. Either way, I started assembling the hull, which was a little bit tricky due to the aforementioned warping. I found that the two side hulls were particularly out of shape and weren't straight, but I managed to hold them in position using some bulldog clips, and eventually they straightened out, and whatever gaps I'd later fill up with some putty. Once the hull had been assembled, I then moved on to the suspension. This is probably one of the fiddliest parts of the kit, not only because each suspension consisted of 12 parts, but they were also positioned a bit awkward on the sprue, which made cutting them off without breaking them very difficult. In a lot of cases, as you'll see, I did manage to break some parts, but fortunately the way the bogies are assembled means that they're pretty solid, and you're kind of able to glue parts if they break. You have to put on around about 8 wheels onto each set of bogies, and it's a little bit of a fiddly process, as you can see. I've been generous and spared you the pain of watching me assemble 4 of these bogies, and instead only show doing 1, but I can promise you that there was a lot of tweezering and a lot of swear words involved while making these parts.
All these wheels and these tracks are tiny little, impossibly fiddly bits. It really is utterly frustrating, and actually hardly worth the bother.
Although I was definitely starting to agree with James May at this point, I did persevere and eventually managed to assemble all of the bogies. I glued the completed bogies to the sides of the tank hull, and then after all 4 were in place, I moved on to building the rest of the running gear. The return rollers were glued into place first. Unfortunately, these parts were so tiny and fiddly, sometimes the moulding meant that they weren't able to actually be fitted to the hull very easily, but I managed to persevere and glue them into place. I then cut out the sprockets and the covers. Interestingly, for the 35T, or at least in this kit, both the idler and the drive sprockets are exactly identical, both having teeth gears, which is a little bit unusual for a tank. There's also a 5th kind of bogie, or a separate wheel is probably a more appropriate term. I believe the 35T was based on the Vickers light tank suspension system, with the extra wheel added in to make the tank hull a little bit longer. I then glued the drive sprocket and the idler into position. I believe the drive sprocket is the one in the rear, however, since they're both identical, it doesn't really matter too much. I also glued on a small scraper thing that seems to be for taking mud possibly off the tracks or the wheels as the tank goes along, and then I glued the sort of front slope plate and the side skirt part into position. I had to hold it down using a little bit of masking tape, however it was nothing compared to the difficulties I would face with the tops part of the hull. I managed to put the drivers and the bow gunner's plate into position, and then I had a go at putting the roof onto the hull. This part was slightly bent at roughly where the turret ring is, and you can kind of see some of the marks where I tried to bend it into place and it broke. I managed to hold it down using a little bit of Tamiya masking tape, but there were still some considerable gaps that I'd have to cover up later on. I then moved on to the turret, first by gluing the cannon to the recoil barrel part, and then gluing the two tank turret sides together and the roof to the two turret sides. The parts were a little bit bent, as very much similar to the hull, because of possibly the kit's age. However, I did manage to bend them roughly into shape so that the seams were relatively small. However, later on I would have to obviously use a bit of putty on the turret. The machine gun was a bit of a fiddly part. It didn't really have a section that would join very easily to the ball mount, so I sort of had to wedge it into place and use the glue to melt the plastic a little bit. So I even managed to get the cannon barrel to elevate and depress. The last thing to do to the turret before I was ready to putty up the model was to glue in the vision slits, and there was also a nice big separate commander's hatch, which I decided to leave off so that I could open and close it during stop motions. With the turret and most of the tank hull complete, it was almost time to fix up some of the gaps from the bent plastic. There were a few small details to glue on, such as the 4 towing hatches, 2 on the front and 2 on the rear, and then I was ready to get out some of my water-based Vallejo putty. I tried to fill the putty in from the inside as much as possible to avoid getting putty on the raised details. Since the tank was made out of rivets, then riveted to a frame, the model had included the riveting detail on the outside. In some cases I did have to apply a little bit of putty on the outside, but I used my fingers to remove the excess. One of the good things about the water-based Vallejo putty is that it's, well, as the name implies, water-based, which means if you get a bit on your fingers, you can pretty easily clean it up. As you can see, I had to do a fair bit of puttying. The only gap I kind of left was on the sides of the tank hull, where based on reference photos I'd seen there is a little bit of a gap. However, I still cut out some polystyrene sheets and glued them to the inside of the turret so you couldn't see the whole way through the tank and have all that daylight coming in. Being pretty much exclusively used in the early years of World War II by the Wehrmacht, the Panzer 35T would have rarely been seen in any scheme other than Dunkel Grau, so Tamiya XF63 German Grey was chosen as the sole colour for the outside of the tank. I apply it using a relatively large brush after mixing a little bit of water with the paint to thin it down, and then I paint it over the entire model. I usually find spots that I can hold on the tank and don't paint them, such as when I was painting the hull I held on to parts of the drivetrain, and then when I was painting the lower part of the hull I'd hold on to the roof of the tank to make sure my hands didn't get covered in paint, or worse, I smudged up the paint that I'd just applied. I build it up in layers to reduce the chance of any visible brush strokes and to help make more of the surface detail visible. Another trick to ensuring a high quality finish with hand painting, as you'll see, is to apply the paint in the same direction as much as possible rather than in random brush strokes all over the place. For the most part, I'll try and paint from the front of the tank or the turret to the rear by dragging the brush in that direction. I ended up painting around about 3 or 4 layers of German Grey over the entire tank before it was time to apply some decals. The decals included in this kit are quite a nice selection for the German army. You have some 6 Panzer Division symbols, a set of Balkenkreuzes, a couple of specific vehicle digits, and also a set of random digits and an uncensored Nazi flag for the back of the tank. I applied the decals in a little bit of water, and then once they'd started to slide away from the paper, I applied them using a brush. The ESCI decals had survived pretty well considering they were about 40 years old. I had none of them break up on me, and they weren't even that yellowed, to be honest. In fact, they're probably better than some modern decals you can still get today. I applied the numbers included for a tank from the 6th Panzer Division, and once I'd applied all the decals, I rubbed a little bit of decal softener over the top of them using a fine brush, and then I applied some Tamiya decal adhesive to help them conform to the model. I thought this would be important because there were a few rivets that were in places where the decals were. I left the model overnight for the decals to set before proceeding to painting the rubber strips that are on the return rollers and the road wheels using a very fine brush and some Tamiya XF1 flat black. The same brush was then used to apply some XF16 flat aluminium onto the machine gun barrels and some X31 titanium gold onto the exhausts. I used a little bit of an aluminium kind of packaging and a pair of scissors to create a small shape for the headlight, and used a little bit of super glue to glue it onto the plastic headlight that was included on the kit. I also added a little bit of copper wire leading from the side of the tank onto the light, which I'd seen some reference photos of. Following another coat of X31 titanium gold, I then used some dark grey and the fine brush to neaten up any mistakes I'd made on the road wheels, to paint these sort of handles that hold onto the exhausts, and also to add a little bit of chipping onto the markings of the vehicle where the white was. Being an old kit, unfortunately you have to put up with the old school rubber tracks. I don't bother using anything to melt the tracks together, as I think that's a bit too fiddly, and instead just use the stapler to staple the two hubs together, and later on I'll hide the stapler a little bit with some weathering techniques. I then try to, as gently as possible, stretch the track onto the road and running gears without accidentally breaking anything, which I fortunately managed to do this time. Next it was time for a little bit of extra weathering. I used a fine brush to dab some XF16 flat aluminium onto some paper towel to make it nice and dry so that the paint wouldn't run, and then I stipple it all over the model to create some metal chipping. I focus primarily on the exposed plates that would likely be scratched as the tank drives past trees and that sort of stuff, and also on the various access hatches and areas where the crew are likely to walk and scratch the metal. I also applied it a little bit onto the sides of the mudguards and also along some parts of the running gear. After the metal chipping has dried, I then go on with some German grey and cover up some of the excess scratches just to soften the effect and make it a little bit more subtle. Next I get out a cocktail stick and dip it in a little bit of Vallejo Weathering Effects Mud and Grass, and then I smear it onto the side of the tank and on the undersides to create some build up of some dirt and grass to make the tank look like it's been a little bit dirty and not received much of a clean. The areas I focus primarily are in the areas between all of the bogies and also on the lower side of the hull and on the mudguards. I try to avoid getting it on the road wheels, as since these parts are moving they'd quite regularly be shaking off a lot of the dirt and grass, and later on I'll add some other weathering effects to those parts. The mud and grass effects are also not a bad way to hide the staples, since if you smear them over it, it will sort of stain them a little bit of a brownish colour, helping them to blend in with the rest of the track. Next I get out a little bit of Tamiya black panel liner scent and dab it onto the hatches and the vision slits, and also onto the engine deck. This helps to highlight the details, and in the case of the engine deck I dab it over the back to create some oil and sort of stained effects from the engine being opened up and a lot of dirt coming out. After I've applied it, I wipe away the excess using a cotton tip. You can also use a little bit of enamel thinners to help remove it, since it won't react with the acrylic paint underneath. Next, I get out some Tamiya weathering powders and apply a little bit of rust onto the exhaust, and using a fine brush I streak a little bit of sand and dirt effects down the side of the turret and on various areas of the tank such as the mudguards and on the sides of the hull to help create a little bit of dirt. Since they're water based, you can wipe away the excess either using a finger, or later on you can dampen a cotton bud slightly and then wipe it along the edge to remove the excess and help blend it in. I also drag a fair bit over the roof of the turret, since a lot of the time the crew would be walking or standing on this part and their feet might be covered in dirt or mud and grass. Some lighter sand colours and also a little bit of black are streaked down the rear of the tank where a lot of dirt would fall, and also if there's been any leaks or maintenance done on the tank, a little bit of oil might have dragged down the back of the vehicle. To get a little bit of a stronger effect than just the weathering powders, I get some Tamiya XF52 flat earth, and after thinning it a lot with some water, I dab it all over the running gear. As you can see, the consistency is very wet and there's barely any paint in it at all. This helps it flow into all of the cracks where dirt most likely would get, and I then wipe it off using a cotton tip to remove some of the excess. A little bit of extra flat earth is also put underneath the exhaust where a little bit of dirt might be able to build up due to the small crack, and then I apply some shading effects by painting the underside of the tank flat black, and I carefully paint the wire leading to the light on the front of the tank flat black using a fine brush. And once that was done, the tank was completed. There's also a crew figure included in the set, however I decided I would save him for possibly a future video or just do him in my own time. And here you can see a few pictures of the finished tank. And overall, I've got to say I'm really happy with what I managed to achieve with this kit. I'm experimented for the first time with the Vallejo mud and grass effects on this kit. I'm really happy with how they look. And despite all of the challenges that I face, such as the very fiddly running gear and also the warped kind of plastic parts, I think I managed to overcome these challenges and I'm really happy with the final result. And I look forward to hopefully getting this tank into a few of my animations in the future. Now, as I mentioned, this kit was reissued not too long ago by Italeri, and the tooling by Italeri is exactly the same. There are no additional parts, and you've still got those rubber band tracks. The main difference between this kit and the Italeri kit is the markings. You've got markings for the early Poland campaign with just the white cross, you've got a marking for the Slovakian army, you've got a 6th Panzer Division similar to what I've done, and you've also got a Romanian tank. So you've got a fair few different options for markings, and they also greatly reflect the varied service history of the 35T. It was used by a lot of Germany's allies during World War II.
This is my best friend, Valentina. She's an ally. Talk, Valentina. Ally.
The 35Ts were sold as hand-me-downs once the Germans decided they were obsolete at the start of the invasion of Russia, and that's why it ended up in so many different minor Axis powers' hands who were very desperate to get whatever tanks they could find. This kit retails for around about 30 AUD in Australia, and whether or not it's worth that I think is a little bit debatable. Considering it's a pretty old kit, it's a very small tank, and it's recycled tooling, I don't know if it would exactly be worth $30, perhaps more around the 20 or at most 25 would be a little bit more reasonable in my opinion. However, it's still a pretty good kit and I definitely recommend having a go, especially if you're interested in more obscure German stuff or pre-war tanks. If you're a beginner, however, I would not recommend this as the suspension is incredibly fiddly, but fortunately First to Fight, which is a small Polish company, do the 35T as both the radio reconnaissance version and the normal tank, and it's a much simpler kit at the expense of a little bit of detail here and there. So if you're a bit new to building tanks, this one is a much simpler and easier and also slightly cheaper way to go. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And special shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund my videos. You guys are wonderful people, and if you want to join my patrons and see exclusive content and help support my channel, be sure to check out my Patreon in the description of my video. And thank you very much for watching, and until the next video, model on!